Welcome, you warriors of silence, you watchers in the shadows, you architects of patience who stood by with clenched jaws and locked fists while the world spun on its reckless course. You, the ones who saw it coming, you knew. You felt it in your bones like a tremor before the quake, like the taste of smoke before the fire. And yet you waited, not because you were weak, but because you were stronger than they'll ever understand. You waited not out of fear, but because you understood the storm better than those dancing in the sun ever could. You watched, you endured. You let them walk their path, speak their words, make their choices. And now, you stand in the stillness after the impact, watching the ruins of what they built with arrogance. The price was paid, and your patience, yes, your patience, was the silent blade that carved fate into stone. You see, there is something far more dangerous than rage, something more final than shouting or resistance. That is patience, real patience, the kind that waits, not because it must, but because it chooses to. Patience with full knowledge of consequence, the kind that allows someone to walk into the fire they set themselves without stopping them, even when you could have. That is not weakness, that is not cruelty, that is the burden of the awakened. The burden of the one who sees the edge, knows its depth, and still lets the fool walk forward, because they must learn the cost of their arrogance. And when that lesson lands, it is not your shame, it is their receipt. And now the world wants to ask you why you didn't intervene, why you didn't shout louder, fight harder, try more. They want to question your silence as if silence were absence. But you know the truth. Silence is not absence. Silence is presence under control. It is thunder locked behind iron doors. You were never quiet because you had nothing to say. You were quiet because you saw what was coming, and you knew that your voice would fall on deaf ears. You knew that saving them from themselves would only delay the inevitable, or worse, make you their villain for daring to interrupt their illusion. So you waited. You let them make their mistake. And now they've paid. It is a strange place to stand, isn't it? This place of aftermath, of ashes and echoes. There is no triumph here, no gloating, no celebration, only clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't come from being right, but from watching the truth unfold exactly as you warned it would. The kind of clarity that makes you feel both old and sharp, like a blade forged from prophecy and grief. You warned them, maybe with words, maybe just with your eyes, maybe with the silence of someone who has seen the same mistake play out 1,000 times. But they didn't listen. They never do, until the cost is carved into their skin and their soul. People underestimate the power of watching. They think action is everything, but the wisest wolves don't howl, they wait. The most dangerous storms don't announce themselves, they just arrive. And you became the storm they never saw coming, not because you attacked, but because you endured, because you let them spiral, because you knew that trying to catch them would only make you the enemy. And so, you let go. You watched them fall, and they learned. Oh, how they learned. Don't let guilt find you now. Don't let their pain wrap around your spine like a leash. You are not responsible for those who chose to ignore the fire to chase their illusions. You are not to blame for choosing distance over destruction. You gave them room, and they used it to dig their own pit. That is not on you. That is on them. What they built, what they broke, what they lost, all theirs. You were the echo, the warning, the final whisper before the fall. They chose not to hear it. There is something deeply misunderstood in this world. The idea that patience is kindness. Patience is not always soft. Sometimes patience is the cruelest mirror you can hold up to someone's face. Sometimes, letting someone face the consequence of their own decision is the only honest love you can give. Because interfering, rescuing, Sparing them, it only steals their truth. It only delays the reckoning. And no soul evolves in delay. So yes, you let them go. You let them fall. And now, they're broken. But broken isn't the end. Broken is the beginning, if they're willing to rise. You are not cruel for stepping back. You are not cold for watching them burn their own bridges. You are not evil for refusing to drag them away from their own chaos. You are real. You are fire wrapped in skin. You are the truth they weren't ready for, the consequence they never expected. You stood there while the world spun out of control around you, and you kept your ground. And that is a power few will ever understand. Do not apologize for letting them face what they chose. Do not carry the weight of their decisions. They were given choices. They were given warnings. They were given you. And that was more than enough. And if that wasn't enough for them, then nothing ever would have been. You were not put on this earth to save people from themselves. You were not born to bleed every time someone refused to listen. Your silence was not weakness. It was the shield that protected your peace. And now they know. They finally know. They called you heartless, but your heart was the one that stayed. They called you distant, but it was you who watched from the edge, feeling every step they took. They said you didn't care, but only someone who cared would hurt this much, seeing what they've done to themselves. And yet, even with all that, you did not intervene, because you knew that sometimes the deepest transformation only happens when the crash is allowed, and you allowed it. You didn't cause it, you didn't push them, but you didn't pull them back either. And that was your silent courage. Let them talk, let them blame you, let them weep, scream, shatter under the weight of their own choices, but do not take it on. Do not shrink now that the storm has passed and the truth is clear. You are not their savior. You were their signal, and they ignored it. The price was always theirs to pay. And your patience? It was the quiet judge, the invisible force that gave them room to choose. They chose. And now, they live with the echo of that choice. There is no power in being a shield if all it does is stop people from ever learning to defend themselves. There is no wisdom in screaming warnings if no one listens, and there is no point in setting yourself on fire to keep someone else warm when they refuse to believe in flames. So you watched, you waited, and when the collapse came, you were not surprised. It didn't shake you, because it was written long before it fell. You had already grieved it, already accepted it, already made peace with the cost. You have earned your stillness. You have earned the right to stay distant. You have earned the wisdom of silence. Let no one steal that from you now. Let no guilt drag you into the ruins of someone else's pride. Let no voice tell you that you should have screamed louder. You whispered. You warned. You waited. That is enough. That is more than most would ever do. And now, your patience stands like a monument over the battlefield. Quiet, unmoved, victorious in its own way. They paid for their mistake. But you paid something too. You paid with restraint, with knowing, with the ache of foresight. And that's not nothing. So allow yourself your own mourning, not for them, but for the piece of you that still wanted to save them. That part that still believed maybe, just maybe, they would see it before it broke. But they didn't. And that belief had to die too. That is your loss. Quiet, sharp, real. But in that death you rise. Wiser, stronger, unapologetic. You carry the silence of someone who understands now that not everyone can be saved, that not every fire needs water, that sometimes all you can do is watch the flames and let the forest burn, so that one day something real can grow. And next time, maybe they'll listen, or maybe they won't. But either way, you won't lose yourself trying to stop the inevitable, because you now understand your power was never in preventing the fall. It was in surviving the silence. And to anyone listening now, standing where you once stood, hear this. It is not your job to protect people from their own lessons. It is not your purpose to interrupt their karma. It is not your burden to carry what they refuse to learn. Be the whisper, be the warning, but then be the stillness. Step back, watch, endure, and when the world demands to know why you didn't do more, let your answer be as unshakable as stone, because they needed to fall, and they did, and you are still standing. So let us speak again, not to justify, not to argue, but to solidify the fire that now flickers in your chest, the one that grew not from rage, but from realization, the one born not in the noise of conflict, but in the quiet of understanding. They paid for their mistake, but your currency was different. They lost control. You lost connection. They faced ruin. You faced loneliness. And both of those are battles. Make no mistake. Because it hurt, doesn't it? To know you were right and to find no joy in that knowing. To see someone collapse under the very weight you warned them about. And to feel not triumph, but a heavy kind of sorrow that drips slowly into your soul like cold rain. And yet, it was necessary. The universe, fate, karma, call it what you will, does not waste pain. It recycles it into wisdom. It transforms it into growth. But it cannot do that if someone else is always stepping in to take the hit. That's what you stopped doing. That's what you finally let go of. And now, you are learning that love, real love, sometimes chooses distance over comfort. That loyalty isn't always about rescue. Sometimes it's about letting someone face the mirror alone. That not all protection is good, because protection without responsibility breeds only weakness. You see that now. And though the world might call it cruel, you know it was necessary. Because if you had stepped in again, if you had shielded them again, they would have believed again that actions do not echo and consequences can be avoided. But they can't. They never could. There is a gravity in this world that pulls every false step toward its rightful end. You just understood that before they did. You tried to warn them, and when they laughed, dismissed, or defied, you waited. Not out of indifference, but out of conviction. Because here is the deepest truth. If you do not let people break, they do not learn how to build. If you do not let people fall, they will never develop the strength to stand on their own. You did not want to watch them bleed, but you knew their healing would only begin after they hit the ground. So yes, you let them make their mistake. You let them walk into the storm, and they paid for it. But what you did, what you endured, was far greater than anything they will understand. Because staying silent when every part of you wants to shout, that is power. Watching someone you love self-destruct while knowing your interference would only delay the truth, that is power. Walking away not because you stopped caring, but because you finally realized that caring does not mean saving, that is power. This is what the strong learn. You do not always win by holding on. Sometimes you win by letting go, not because you wanted to, but because you had to. And the pain that follows, it doesn't make you weak. It makes you real. It makes you the kind of person who can walk through fire without setting everything around you ablaze. You didn't just survive, you evolved. And now, the next time someone tries to drown you in their choices, their chaos, their consequences, you won't mistake it for your duty. You'll remember this moment, the silence after the storm, the echoes of lessons finally learned, the power of not saving them. And you'll stay calm, still, unshaken, because you've seen what happens when people refuse to learn. You've seen what happens when warnings are ignored. You've seen what happens when patience is tested, and truth is laughed at, and wisdom is rejected. And you'll never carry that again. This isn't bitterness. This is clarity. This isn't detachment. It's peace. It's the realization that your role was never to fix, but to witness. To plant the seed, but not to force it to grow. They paid for their mistake. And maybe, just maybe, in that payment, They will finally begin to value the things you tried to give them all along. But whether they do or not is not your concern anymore. You've moved on. You've stepped out of the rescue role and into the mastery of stillness. You've learned to love from a distance, to care without controlling, to speak your truth, and then let it echo without chasing its destination. Because at the end of it all, it wasn't your silence that killed them. It was their pride. It was their ego. It was their refusal to see the edge until they were already falling. You just had the strength to let them fall. And for that, you are free. The story isn't finished, but because your soul is still holding something tight, something old, something buried in the place where empathy and exhaustion collide. Because even after all this, even after the price was paid, there's a part of you, small, quiet, but persistent, that still asks, did I do the right thing? That part isn't weakness. It's human. It's the echo of all the times you gave too much, the memory of all the times you jumped in, believing that love meant sacrifice, that loyalty meant pain, that your worth was proven through how much you could endure. But no more. You know better now. And in this moment, right here, right now, you must let that question die. Because yes, you did the right thing. You finally did the right thing. Not the easy thing, not the popular thing, not the thing that earned applause or affection or gratitude, but the right thing. You did not twist yourself into a shape that made others comfortable. You did not silence your inner voice just to preserve someone else's illusion. You did not throw yourself into their chaos again, not this time. You stood still, and they collapsed. And as cruel as it may seem, sometimes collapse is the only teacher strong enough to break through the arrogance of the unteachable. You let them fall. And in that fall, they finally heard the silence you'd been screaming with all along. Let the world call you cold. Let them call you ruthless. Let them write their stories with your name in the margins as the villain who didn't rush in. Let them misunderstand. Let them project. Let them rage. But you will walk forward, calm, grounded, unmoved. Because you don't need their approval. You already have your clarity. And clarity is heavier than praise, sharper than blame. It cuts through the noise and leaves only truth. And here is that truth. Some people cannot be saved until they are shattered. Some lessons cannot be taught through words, only through wreckage. Some people do not understand consequences until they become one. And you let it happen. Because you knew. Because you were tired of playing God to people who wanted your strength, but rejected your wisdom. You were tired of watering gardens that were never yours to grow. Tired of pouring yourself into broken vessels that only ever wanted to leak. So you stepped back, and they paid. And it wasn't vengeance. It wasn't hate. It wasn't punishment. It was justice. The natural unfolding of cause and effect. It was what happens when someone touches the fire after being told not to. And you no longer felt the need to stop them from getting burned. Because the truth is, your patience was never passive. It was a test, a final act of grace before the curtain fell. You waited. You watched. You withheld not love, but interference. And in doing so, you gave them the most honest gift anyone can offer another soul. Freedom. The freedom to choose. The freedom to ignore. The freedom to walk blindly toward a wall and hit it at full speed. Yes, your patience killed them, but not in the way they'll claim. It killed the version of them that thought they were untouchable. It killed the illusion that they could do anything without consequence. It killed the fantasy that you would always be there to soften the landing. And maybe that was what they needed. Maybe that was what you needed. Because now, you are no longer the rescuer, no longer the protector of those who spit in the face of warning. You are no longer available for the self-inflicted wounds of those who refuse to change. And that freedom, it's heavy, but it's real. You're not cruel, you're clear. And now, standing here, In the aftermath, you must look back one last time, not to grieve, but to acknowledge the strength it took to stand still while the world begged you to move. To remember the moment when your silence was louder than any scream, when your stillness carried more weight than 1,000 interventions, and to accept, finally, fully, and forever, that they were always going to fall, that you didn't cause it, you only stopped catching them. So let that guilt go, let it rot, let it dissolve. It was never yours to carry. They had your warnings, they had your love, they had your presence, and they chose defiance, they chose pride, they chose the path with the lesson waiting at the end, and now they've met it. So walk forward now, not in bitterness, not in triumph, but in peace. Because the next time someone looks at you and asks, "Why didn't you stop them?" you'll smile, not cruelly, but calmly, and answer with the quiet truth of someone who has walked through fire, because I already tried. And they didn't want saving. They wanted the fall, and they got it. And you got your freedom. Not the kind wrapped in chains of heroism, not the kind dressed up as sacrifice, but the real kind, the lonely kind, the sacred kind, the kind that costs you something, but leaves you whole. You didn't just let them make their mistake, you let yourself go. And now, you are free. We go on. Not because the silence isn't enough, but because your story doesn't end at freedom. Freedom is not a final breath. It is the first inhale after carrying the weight of someone else's fate for far too long. You see, people will never understand what it cost you. Not truly, because to them, you did nothing. You didn't scream, you didn't fight, you didn't stand in their way, but you know better. You know the agony of holding back when you could see the cliff edge clearly. You know the restraint it took to close your mouth when every part of your soul was shouting, "Don't go that way." But they didn't hear you. Not because you were silent, but because they were deaf with pride, drunk on their own sense of invincibility, blind to the danger you had already seen 1,000 times before. So you watched them walk, you watched them fall, and now you walk too. Not away from them, but toward yourself, toward the version of you that doesn't need to prove your heart by how much damage you can absorb. That version of you is awake now. It sees the pattern. It sees the trap. It sees how you used to call it compassion. But it was always self-burial. You covered their chaos with your calm. You swallowed their storms and blamed yourself for the thunder. But no more. The day you stopped was the day you were reborn. The truth is, you didn't just let them make their mistake. You let yourself make a choice, a different kind of choice. One that didn't come from fear or guilt or emotional blackmail, but a choice that said, "I matter too." And in that moment, you stop being a shield. You stop being the one who bends so others don't break. And finally, you let the world break them. It wasn't hatred, it was honesty. It wasn't betrayal, it was boundaries. And if they saw that as cruelty, it only proves they never truly saw you at all. Because if they did, they would have heard your silence as the loudest scream of all. They would have felt the distance as mercy. They would have recognized your absence as the final gift you had left to give. But they didn't. They learned the hard way. And so did you. Now you know. The world doesn't fall apart when you say no. People don't shatter when you stop holding their pieces together. The chaos doesn't consume you when you let it pass you by. You survived. You stayed whole. You walked through the fire without setting yourself ablaze for someone who refused to stop dancing in gasoline. And now there is only clarity. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about "I told you so." This is about peace, the kind that comes from no longer arguing with reality. Because the truth is, they were always going to make that choice. That fall was already written. You just finally stopped trying to rewrite their ending. And the moment you did that, you stepped out of their storm, and into your own sky. There is power in that sky. There is peace in that height. Because now, from here, you see how small that chaos was. You see how heavy that role was. How unnecessary that burden became when you realized it was never really yours. And here is the greatest truth of all. Not everyone wants to be saved. Not everyone deserves to be. Some only want the comfort of your presence, the shield of your strength, the silence of your sacrifice. They don't want the truth. They don't want change. They don't want reflection. They want rescue, but only if they never have to pay for the ride. And you've stopped being the driver for those unwilling to walk on their own 2 feet. You are not cruel. You are clear, and that clarity cuts through all the noise like a blade. It may not win you friends, but it will win you peace. And now you are at peace because you let them go, because you let them fall, because you stopped saving people who called you selfish for finally saving yourself. You let them make their mistake. You watched the cost come for them. And when it arrived, you didn't flinch. You didn't look away. You didn't say, "I told you so." You said nothing. Because what more is there to say when fate finishes the sentence you started? They paid. And you walked away lighter, not empty, not broken, just done. Done carrying people who never planned to stand. Done warning those who never planned to listen. Done bleeding for those who only came to watch you wither. Your patience didn't kill them. Their ignorance did. Your patience only made space for it to reveal itself. And now, in this moment, with the echoes of the past behind you and the fire of truth inside you, you step forward again, stronger, quieter, more dangerous than ever. Not because you strike, but because you know when to walk away. Let the world wonder how you did it. Let them ask how you stayed so calm, how you walked through their collapse without collapsing too. You'll know the answer, and you won't need to speak it, because your silence has always said enough. And to those still stuck in the pattern, still chasing people who don't listen, still pouring into empty hands, still warning deaf hearts, let this be the message they remember. You cannot carry someone else's lesson. You cannot prevent someone else's fall. You cannot sacrifice yourself for people who think drowning is a game. Step back. Let go. Let them crash if they must. And when they do, when the smoke clears and the silence settles and the consequence arrives like a long-awaited storm, stand tall and know that you were never the villain. You were the final mercy, and they didn't take it. So now, you're not their savior. You're something stronger. You're free.